Well, thank you for joining us as we are going through the parables of Jesus in our series called Fables and Folktales. So we're kind of coming close. This is the last week of this. We'll do this one today and the one that'll release on Thursday.
Yep.
And that's it. That's the end. We've got no more parables to do. We will have to do something else.
Yes.
Anyway, we're going to do the parable of the rich man and Lazarus today.
Cool.
All right. So let's jump right in there to the idea of that Jesus is talking to his disciples. He's talking to them about the lost sheep. We're in Luke. He's talking about the lost coin, the parable of the prodigal son.
Yeah, then he's gone on to the parable of the shrewd manager.
Yeah, and that's right before this, essentially. Yeah. And I really think it's really good to note, verse 14, and I think we should read it because it is, even though it's a couple verses later, verse 19, that the parable actually starts. Verse 14 does kind of set up a little bit of why maybe.
Yeah. And it ties right in, or it comes right on the back of the parable of the shrewd manager.
Yeah.
And the two are definitely connected here.
And so it's important to know that, yes, he's talking to his disciples, but Pharisees are there.
Yeah.
All right. So
they seem to be everywhere.
At
that particular time in Jesus' ministry. So, okay, let's read it together. Starting at verse 14. The Pharisees, who loved money, heard all of this and were sneering at Jesus. He said to them, "You are the ones who justify yourselves in the eyes of others, but God knows your hearts. What people value highly is detestable in God's sight."
All right, so I think just before we move into verse 19, which is the parable, actual parable, I think it's important to take note that Luke is characterizing these Pharisees as lovers of money, and that God is able to see their heart, kind of beneath the veneer, beneath the show.
Yeah.
And this is a normal thing when coming to the parables, that they are more, when it comes to following even God's law, like when all that sort of stuff, they seem to be more, what they've deemed important or what they put focus on are the part of the law that sort of is outside of things, as opposed to the inside.
The inside, things. And we know from other parables and from just reading the Gospels that the Pharisees were very obsessed with money, and they were taking advantage of the temple system to put pocket money for themselves. Yeah. So they obviously were very comfortable doing that. And again, they put on this pious religious outward look, but inside they were scamming and cheating and taking advantage of people when it came to money and how the temple operated. So, and then I guess they would see Jesus as a threat to that. And he's again taking another poke at the bear here.
And he's challenging them on the area of what counts, and that's really what's not seen.
Is not seen, yeah. Okay, let's read the parable then. Right. There was a rich man who was dressed in purple and fine linen and lived in luxury every day. At his gate was laid a beggar named Lazarus, covered with sores, and longing to eat what fell from the rich man's table. Even the dogs came and licked his sores. The time came when the beggar died, and the angels carried him to Abraham's side. The rich man also died and was buried. In Hades, where he was in torment, he looked up and saw Abraham far away with Lazarus by his side. So he called to him, "Father Abraham, have pity on me and send Lazarus to dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue, because I am in agony in this fire." But Abraham replied, "Son, remember that in your lifetime you received your good things, while Lazarus received bad things. But now he is comforted here, and you are in agony. And besides all this, between us and you, a great chasm has been set in place, so that those who want to go from here to you cannot, nor can anyone pass or cross over from there to us." He answered, "Then I beg you, Father, send Lazarus to my family, for I have 5 brothers. Let him warn them, so that they too will also not come to this place of torment." And Abraham replied, "They have Moses and the prophets. Let them listen to them." "No, Father Abraham," he said, "if someone from the dead goes to them, then they will repent." He said to them, "If they do not listen to Moses and the prophets, they will not be convinced, even if someone rises from the dead."
All right, so really kind of what we have in this whole thing is we start off with seeing contrasts and reversal of those contrasts. So using hyperbole, which Jesus tends to do in the parables, you've got a rich man characterized not only as rich, but with great luxuries. The idea of he's wearing purple
Which
and
is
fine
a
linens.
royal
Yeah,
color,
like you just, not everyone could just wear purple.
Yeah.
It wasn't even so much, I guess, that what you could afford, but like you had to be of a certain designation to actually wear it.
So this guy's not just rich; he's really rich.
And he's elite. And he's in society, and as well, we find out he has gates.
Yep.
So he's got some sort of large house
estate.
So everyone would have seen him kind of in that, the idea of that time in that society, probably even this, we would see the same way now, as blessed. Kind of, this is the top of achievement. This is where people would probably want to be.
Yep.
Like, if I could only be half of that even, but he would have been seen blessed.
Yeah, the Bill Gates and Elon Musk's of
absolutely.
our time. And in that particular time, particularly for religious people, they would see any rich people as being that they must have done something right to be blessed by God.
Exactly. And Lazarus is the complete opposite. He's on the wrong side of that gate. All he can do is beg, and really his greatest hope is just whatever the rich man can spare or decides to, just whatever, the scraps.
Or basically throw out.
Yeah, like it's just like whatever you absolutely don't want.
Yeah.
And not only this is that with the idea of the dog licking sores is an important part there, because this would have made Lazarus unclean.
Yeah.
And so he's got nothing going for him.
So what does unclean mean in that culture?
Well, it's just the idea of there's certain things that would be clean, the ritualistic kind of idea of in Jewish law.
So he wouldn't have been able to go to temple.
He would have been unclean or outcast, if you will, in that sense as well. So basically, there's everything. He's got nothing going for him in this sense.
So he's sick. He can't worship. He can't even be touched by other people. He has to beg for food. He can't even hold down a job.
Yeah, and then, like, as you just sort of mentioned, like they would have seen the rich man is blessed by God.
Yeah. Because
of this, especially this addition of unclean. You definitely, the fact that there's a lot going for him. He was poor and sores and all that sort of stuff. But this unclean, like he's absolutely cursed by God. So it's the exact opposite.
So this guy isn't just down and out. He's everything's
gone wrong. In that sort of
everything that could go wrong has gone wrong for this guy.
Exactly, and so that's where you have the contrast.
Yeah,
and then when they die, we have a reversal.
Mm-hmm.
We have Lazarus carried by angels to Abraham's side. So this picture of comfort and care.
Yeah.
And the rich man just died and had buried. Like, it's just kind of like there's no ceremony. Like, literally, there probably was a ceremony.
Yeah,
but really, in the story, it's very unceremonious. Like, he died. Like, Lazarus is just so like the angels came and picked him up and carried him right to the side of Abraham and just like, he died.
Yeah.
Just the end of that. So, and then in the story, he finds himself in Hades, the place of the dead. And I think that what happens is the challenge is the listeners is because they probably would have not thought this wouldn't have been the outcome
that they were expecting.
And because and that's the challenge. Part of the challenge Jesus has hit there is it's not so much that, like rich, bad, poor, good kind of idea. It's the idea of it's not exactly what you think.
What you think it is. So
it's not a guarantee.
Yeah. Now, I've heard lots of people talk about this parable, and a lot of people draw lots of conclusions about heaven and hell or from what Jesus is talking about here. Is that really what this parable is?
It's not about heaven and hell.
Okay.
That doesn't mean you can't glean anything from it.
Yeah.
But we really should hold it loosely because this is the point that Jesus is making.
Okay.
Again, we don't want to sit there and say maybe there's some truth there. There might be.
Yep.
But if we focus on that, we're missing what Jesus is
missing
talking
the
about.
point. Yeah. And I've talked about that before. Lots of times we get sidetracked in the details of the parables, and it's like an effort in missing the point.
Yeah, and it's really important that we see that because sometimes we can just, because those things can be kind of interesting or even worrisome for us.
Yeah, exactly.
We kind of like, this is what is being meant. Mm-hmm. And if sometimes I feel like Jesus would say to us so many times, it's like, no, you're missing the point.
You're missing the point, yeah. So what is the point?
So I think some of the point here is this one is it speaks to who God is, right? This is the only parable that Jesus gives a name to a character.
Oh, that's interesting.
And so that should be just a note right there. If we're reading through the Gospels and be like, okay, now we have a name, not just a certain man,
Yeah.
not just a rich man, not just a
Poor
you know,
man, yeah.
you know, a woman, whatever. In all those cases, this is Lazarus. And Diane Chen actually writes that Lazarus would have been belonging to an invisible class of expendables.
Yep.
That she also would say that even though the interpretation of what we read from the New Living Translation says laid at the gate, which sounds pretty gentle, is the Greek word used there is more likely would have been thrown or cast
And dumped at the gate.
Yeah, like it's not. It's sort of like because
Yeah.
laid does sound like oh here's
Yeah.
a nice comfortable spot for
Yeah.
you to. And it's sort of like no, it's just like just put him there.
Yeah.
This guy's rich, maybe something will go for.
Maybe yeah.
So there is this expendable, invisible idea, and so the fact that Jesus gave this person, who would be in the society, the person that is invisible or forgotten, he gives a name, which gives some humanity to this character. It's not just like that guy or that person that we're trying to ignore. And the name actually means God helps.
So God sees those who other or culture might see as invisible.
Yeah, and I think that's really speaks to who God is because of that sort of idea. He cares for those who are suffering, those who are experiencing injustice, those who are oppressed. And it's really important that we really see it there. And Paul John Isaac writes this really well. The idea of poverty and Jesus seeing those of us who are experiencing that. And it means, he writes this, it means more than a lack of what is necessary for material well-being. It could also mean a denial of the opportunities and choices most basic to human development. That is the opportunity to lead a long and healthy and creative life and enjoy a decent standard of living, freedom, dignity, self-esteem, and respect of others. And that thing's really important, I think, when we see Lazarus there, because it's not just that he's poor. It's just that we get this idea that he can't even do anything for himself to fix that. He's really in poverty, and so it's really big that there's a name God helps there, and I think it's very strategic that Jesus gives us the name because it's sort of this idea of like I see you, I don't see the problem you're in. I see you, and this matters to God, and I think the point God's going to get to is that. Then therefore it should matter to us. Yeah. Those of us who would say we are God's people. And Scott McKnight writes in the book King Jesus Gospel kind of about those who follow Jesus and they kind of devote themselves. And two of the points he brings up in this is, the living a life of loving God and loving others is something we talk about quite a bit. But he also adds to this is to wanted to shape a society, to have a society shaped by justice, especially for those who have been marginalized. Yeah. And that's what we have here. And so this, again, really starts to pick the idea of who God is, and that is he sees the invisible. He cares about those who've been oppressed. He really, they're not just numbers in a system. They have names. They're special.
Yeah, and there's many of the parables have come to the point about I know in the parable of the shrewd manager, for example, the idea that when Jesus explains it, he says to use our resources to serve and to help other people.
That's right. Yeah. And that kind of leads to the other big part of this parable or what's about. And it really is about a parable of hard-heartedness because the rich man does not do what you just talked about.
Yeah, and that's where I think the two parables are connected. Jesus talks about the shrewd manager and then gives that lesson, and he gives that serving others idea, but then he explains it further to make sure that we don't overlook not just someone who might, be a little bit down and out or someone who's a friend that needs a hand up, but for the people who are down and out and marginalized.
Yeah. Yeah. And so it's really, I guess for this idea of the hard-heartedness, what's really kind of revealed in the midst of this, especially after they've passed away, they died. The rich man, talking to Abraham, seems to know Lazarus' name. Yeah. So it's like, he was aware of him. Yeah. And
oops.
Basically, it means we know he could have. I mean, by the
Yeah.
description, like that idea, the listeners would have understand that. So there's no reason he couldn't have given aid, and it probably wouldn't have really affected his bottom line.
No,
any.
it had very much. Yeah.
He just chose not to.
Yeah.
And then Daryl Bach writes this, and I thought this was really interesting. The rich man's view of Lazarus has not changed since death. He still views him as beneath him, as someone who might be sent to give him relief.
Oh, that is something I've never heard before.
Yeah.
That's a really interesting point.
And so, he expected that in this moment still that
Lazarus would serve him.
Yeah, like he
wow.
ignored him, but it's like, oh, like he could serve me, giving him comfort, by and then not only that, but or sending him to his family, which he asked Abraham to do, like so that his family doesn't end up in the same situation he's in. Well, send Lazarus to appear before them, and so they changed their way.
I wonder why he didn't ask him to send himself.
That's just it. It's just sort of that isn't interesting. I never thought that before either.
Just popped into my head.
Yeah,
he asked him to send.
He said
Lazarus.
send Lazarus.
So his family would have been aware of Lazarus too.
Well, yeah,
is the inference.
And there's maybe this hard-heartedness that's going on there. This arrogance that seems to be still present, because the South Asian commentary actually, when talking about the rich man, says he still viewed Lazarus as someone who should be serving him and his family, missing this sinful neglect completely.
Completely, yeah.
And really what happens here is Paul John Isaac writes it. The rich man, he failed to see Lazarus as a brother and a neighbor.
Yeah.
And again, this is not about wealth is bad. It's more about the preoccupation with it.
Yeah, and that's what we talked about in the parable of the shrewd manager, is that money in itself is not bad, but Jesus very carefully explained that, you can't serve God and money. And it's a heart and a character issue about who and it's interesting to me, and I talked about this in the parable of the shrewd manager when we did it on our live stream, is that you would think that when Jesus was saying, who you're going to serve, and you're going to choose between God and something else, like what's the opposite of God? Money isn't the first thing that would even be Satan or evil or some other thing or some other God that would be in opposite to God. But Jesus chooses money because that's where the thing that we're going to have affection for or chase after or be more important to us. And that's what I think carries over into this parable, is that is an extreme demonstration of it with the rich man, is that he isn't just rich, but he's preoccupied with wealth and his status. And it becomes more important to him than the values that God would have for people like Lazarus.
Yeah, and it seems to be like when that preoccupation just becomes that, we start to not see the people that might need it. They're just like, okay, they're in my way, or they're in the way, or if I can just keep them in the periphery. They're really serving my needs,
or just we get so preoccupied with accumulating more wealth or trying to hold on to the wealth we have.
Yeah. And so just to kind of talk more about the hard-heartedness, we've got at the end, kind of, which is, I would say, really kind of a hard-hitting, in that Jesus has, at least the Abraham character, saying that not even the resurrection of Lazarus is going to change the hard hearts of the rich man's family, which I feel like is maybe a bit of foreshadowing. Speaking like, because Jesus himself is going to rise, and that's that it doesn't seem like that will maybe even change
people's
the hard-heartedness of people,
of certain people. Yeah, that's an interesting idea. Yeah,
and even the fact that he says, like, that where you have the rich man, saying like, oh, let me tell, like somehow get this message, send Lazarus to get this message that to my family, and they're like, hey, they've already had this message. Like, it wasn't that.
Yeah.
Whether you didn't, there's no excuse for you not to know. You chose not to. You chose to be preoccupied with this. They have every access to the law and the prophets that say about this. And
they probably held prominent positions in the local synagogue.
Absolutely.
Right? So it's not like they didn't know. Yeah.
And so I think for us, just as we kind of round this up and bring this to an end, it's great humility. I think we need to say to God in prayer, open our eyes and soften our hearts.
Mm-hmm.
Who might we be missing? What could we can be? What is it that we may be preoccupied with that's causing us to miss and people to be invisible? And then I think just we add making sure we're however we're saying it, whether we do the Lord's Prayer, kind of as we find it in whatever translation we're reading of the Bible, or we do sort of our own variation of it, but coming to that idea of your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. That to really be challenged by that, and to continue to do that, and maybe where we're not committing to loving others.
What I actually pray as actually in one of your messages in the live streams a few weeks ago, you talked about the participation part of it.
Yeah.
And so when I pray that part, may your will be done on earth as it is in heaven, I always add the part through my words and my actions today, because God chooses to work through us.
That's a good point, because we can easily say that in let your will be done, but they can do it.
Yeah. Or God, you can do it.
Yeah.
But I don't have to participate.
Yeah. It's about our participation.
Yeah. Well, thanks again for joining with us. And I have found these parables extremely interesting. I think for me, part of it is just talking about all the parables sort of sequentially and seeing the kind of common themes. But we don't always come to light because we tend to take them separately or with other parts of the Gospels. So that has been real eye-opening for me. And I hope you found something that of interest for you as well. And again, if you have something you'd like to share about the parables with us that maybe you've learned that we haven't covered, we'd love for you to make a comment in the notes there or in the chat, and we'd love to be able to respond to you and have a conversation about that. And as always, we usually encourage you to talk about this with someone. It's always helpful to process this in talking with someone. I know that's kind of what we do to prepare for this. And or even as we're doing this, as you saw today, a few things came up that we hadn't even thought of. And so that is always helpful. So we encourage you to do that. And we are just happy to bring this content to you. And we would really appreciate it if you would like and subscribe. It just helps us to be able to continue to do this. So I think we have one more parable to go. We're going to do one more podcast. And then after that, we're going to talk about a new series, I guess. So thanks very much for joining us.